Growing up, there was always one thing I really despised, and that was when my mom came to me and told me to do something, and I'd ask why because I didn't understand why. For example, when I would check the mail and my mom would find out about it, she'd get really mad at me and she'd say, "Don't check the mail, I'll get the mail when I get home." And I'd ask why, and the only thing I'd get back from her was, "Because I said so." Because I said so. That drove me nuts as a kid. I just didn't understand why something couldn't come after that to help explain to me why it was important. I think one time I bothered to actually ask her and pry her enough she gave me a reason. And maybe this was actually after I was 18 and moved out of the house. But I think she told me at one point that she was just worried that I would lose some of the mail. I don't know if she's worried that it would like blow down the road or I'd just misplace it when I get inside, but she was worried she'd lose some important mail. Now I don't know why it was so hard to just tell me that and maybe just ask me to be careful when I'm checking the mail, because it's not like I was going to stop running down to the mailbox and checking for my stuff to arrive as a kid. At least if she had told me, I would have been a little bit careful about it. I equally despise running across recommendations or rules online that could possibly be helpful to me that just simply don't give me a reason why and instead strike me as because I said so. And a great example of that are the plethora of style guides you'll find for different languages online. These can be a great resource to help you improve the code you're creating, but in my opinion, if they don't give you reasons why they make recommendations, they're pretty much worthless. Not only are they worthless, sometimes they're frustrating, because the things inside of these style guides can be rather subjective, and the recommendations could be rather meaningful if some rationale were provided. But instead, a lot of the time, rationale isn't provided. Here's a great example. Here's a JavaScript style guide from Airbnb. I think it's fantastic that they took the time to put all this wonderful information together. Of course, the problem I have with it is right at the very top of this style guide, it starts out saying a mostly reasonable approach to JavaScript. But as I read through this, I see about 60 recommendations or rules inside. And of those, 40 of them don't even have a reason at all. Over 65% of this style guide doesn't tell you why the rule exists or why the recommendation exists. It's simply because I said so. So I don't know how you can start a style guide out saying a mostly reasonable approach. I mean, 20 of 60 is about 33%, so you could maybe say a kind of reasonable approach. What do I mean? Well, let's just take a look at this. One of the very first recommendations is to use the literal syntax for object creation. And then following it is an example of a bad and a good way to do things. Of course, there's no context or understanding to why the first approach is bad and the second is good. In this case, even something simple like, well, it's more concise if you use the object literal style. Okay, that seems reasonable. At least I understand where you're coming from. And if I don't agree about conciseness or conciseness isn't important to me, well, maybe I know that this rule isn't for me. I bet you win a lot of people over, though, by simply telling them it's more concise. Fortunately, the second rule does have some rationale behind it. But in this style guide, it's probably the most extensive rationale. And that rationale simply says it won't work in IE8. Further down in arrays is another example. If you don't know array length, use array push. Okay, and then gives a bad and a good example. Again, no context to this. Now, I might suspect that somebody's worried about performance, probably because I see a lot of links to JSPerf throughout this document, but that's just me speculating at this point. But even beyond performance, even a simple statement like it's more concise or it's more intuitive, it's a little bit easier to read through the second example here. Sumstack.push makes a lot more sense than sumstack and then indexin sumstack.length equals blah, blah, blah. The second example, just look at it, seems more readable to me. So just say that. It's easier to read, it's easier to understand. That's a great reason why to do something. The third example here of the 21 cases I counted as having some reason why is somewhat representative of the why I've seen throughout this document. It's just a link to something that one might go dig into and then conclude is something to do with performance. How about just a simple sentence explaining the performance results of that link that you've provided and why that implicates using slice over this iterative approach? But it's not just why that's important to me when it comes to a style guide. I think it's also important to take it a step further and to ask yourself, what are the biases or the context within which I've made this recommendation, such that if that context were violated or weren't applicable in another situation, somebody might not want to follow this rule. So for example, if you scroll through this like I've been talking about with performance, for somebody copying only a few items in an array in this example, I doubt they're going to have any concern about performance. So put that in here. Put if performance is a concern, use array.slice. Now I don't know if that's what they were indicating here. Again, there's just a link to JSPerf. Now beyond why and providing some context, there's a third thing that I think comes into play, and that's the need to explain your stylistic preferences. What do I mean by that? Well, if we scroll down here a little bit further, you'll see some recommendations for strings. And it recommends using single quotes for strings. Again, no explanation why, so I'm left trying to guess, is there a rational reason for this or not? This to me seems more like an issue of style. If I scroll further down and I get to the section on blocks, it recommends using braces with all multi-line blocks. And if you're using multi-line blocks with if and else, put else on the same line as your if block's closing brace. Okay, a lot of recommendations or rules again with no explanation why. And in this particular case, these to me are all stylistic aspects of writing code. I think what's completely missing here, if somebody would have stopped to think about why, was explaining that it's important for the code to be readable, perhaps, but more importantly, these are examples where consistency leads to readability. And I don't think the actual application of any one set of rule necessarily becomes more readable versus just being consistent. So with strings and single versus double quotes, pick one and stick with it, unless you have another reason why. With braces and white space, if you read throughout the rest of this document, I'll talk about white space and tabs and indentation. Go ahead and make your recommendation for your personal style. That's great. Maybe somebody else doesn't care and they can just pick your style up and run with it and be consistent with it. But just point out where your personal styles are at and remind people that consistency is the thing that's important. And let's actually go down to that section where it talks about white space. Again, this is an issue of consistency in my mind, but here are rules. Use soft tabs set to 2 spaces, place 1 space before the leading brace, and set off operators with spaces a little bit further down. That's that last rule. End files with a single new line character. All of these recommendations have to do with spacing. And it's great that these are all in here, but let's be realistic. How many of us are going to remember all the nuances of white space in a particular project? Because it's not realistic for every project in the world to follow the same set of rules. So as we move between projects, it's not realistic for us to have to remember what the exact white space rules are for all the different elements of code. This style guide, for example, recommends about 10 different rules that have to do with spacing and braces and single quotes and strings. Things that I actually would recommend, instead of putting together in this style guide, I would almost shove them to their own little section and say, hey, these are stylistic preferences of mine. Consistency is what's important. And I'd actually link right in that section to tools that can help you apply a consistent style. Because it's not realistic for humans to remember these things. There are plenty of great editors these days that can help us out, and those are way more important than even talking about the particular rules. When it comes to creating style guides, don't be like my mom and say, because I said so. Be descriptive, don't be prescriptive, because it will give people an understanding of where you come from. It will stop arguments from happening. It will give people the ability to reason through things themselves and decide if their context matches yours. And of course, to do that, provide context. Provide the background that led you to the conclusion you've come to. Think about that context and think about different contexts involved. Maybe think about alternative reasons. Think about trade-offs instead of just recommendations or rules. Think about maybe other styles you've seen people using and explain why the style you're recommending is better than another style. Explain why that other style is better than the style you're recommending. So go back and forth and be able to back up both positions. And then go ahead and lean one way and tell people why. Think about the aspects that you'll recommend that truly are just your personal preferences and flag those. And tell people it's okay for them to form their own personal preferences. And in the cases where style comes into play, just remember to be consistent. And I think it's really important when writing code to point out tools that can help you out, because at the end of the day, nobody can keep 60 different rules together in their mind. So think of what of your rules could just be handed off to some tool to help you out.